There are mornings in Wyoming that do not announce themselves. They do not arrive with color or ceremony. They come before the sun has committed to rising, before the sky has decided what it intends to be, in that particular darkness that exists only in high country winter, the kind of dark that has weight to it, that presses against the skin like cold water, that makes a man understand in some wordless animal part of himself that the world was not made for human comfort and has never pretended otherwise. Colt Harding had been awake since 4 a.m, as he was every morning, not because anything required it, not because the cattle needed him or the fences were calling or the ranch demanded his presence at that particular hour, but because sleep, in recent years, had become a thing he did rather than a thing that happened to him. He woke at 4 because 4 was when the silence was at its most complete, and he had learned, over 12 years of living alone in it, that the silence was easier to carry when you met it standing up. He dressed in the dark, the way men dress when there is no one to see them and no reason to hurry. Wool shirt, heavy canvas trousers, suspenders. The boots he had resoled himself in October, sitting at the table with the awl and the thick thread, working by lamplight while the first snows came down outside the single window. He pulled on his coat, the long canvas one lined with wool that had belonged to his father and still fit across the shoulders though nowhere else, and he went out into the cold. The temperature had dropped overnight to something that was less a weather condition and more a statement of intent. He stood on the porch for a moment and breathed it in, that first breath of outside air in winter that sits in the chest like broken glass before the body learns to accept it. The ranch spread out before him in the pre-dawn dark, the shapes of the outbuildings familiar enough that he did not need light to know them. The small barn, the leaning fence of the near pasture, the tool shed his father had built in the second year, before the cabin was properly finished, because tools needed shelter before men did, which was the kind of practical wisdom that had shaped everything Elias Harding ever built. Colt crossed the yard to the barn, saddled his gray horse Drummond in the dark by feel, and rode out before the sky showed any intention of changing. He took the northern fence line, as he did every third day through the winter months. It was not a task he particularly needed to do this morning. The fences had held through the last storm well enough. But the northern line ran along the property boundary with the Greer land, and the posts up there had a tendency to heave and shift in the frost. And it gave him somewhere to go at an hour when the alternative was to sit in the cabin and listen to it being empty. He had been riding for 40 minutes, moving at a slow walk along the fence line in the pale gray that passed for dawn light in February, when something in the air changed. Not the wind, which had been steady and cutting from the northwest all morning, driving small crystals of snow horizontally across the flat ground so that the surface seemed to move like something alive, something underneath the wind, something that did not belong. Colt reined Drummond to a stop and sat very still in the saddle. He had lived in this country long enough to know its sounds. He knew the cry of a fox in distress, which could stop a man's heart if he was not expecting it. He knew the sound a wounded coyote made in the cold, high, and almost human. He knew the particular silence that preceded a weather change and the different silence that came after one. He knew this land the way a man knows a place he has inhabited for 37 years, which is to say, he knew it in his body before he knew it in his mind. This was not any of those things. He turned Drummond toward the sound and moved through the gap in the fence where a section had come down, the post snapped clean at the base. As he came around the stand of pine that blocked the sight line to the north, the sound separated and sharpened and became unmistakably what it was. 2 voices, 2 cries, small and raw and absolutely human. His hand went to the rifle on the saddle. Old habit. He did not draw it, but the hand went there because that is what hands do when a man is riding toward something he does not yet understand. He moved through the broken fence line into the narrow strip of land that sat between his property and the Greer Ranch, and he saw her. She was tied to one of the broken fence posts. The rope went around her wrists, both of them, looped twice and knotted tight enough that the hemp had already cut through the outer layers of skin. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and black with dried blood along the hem. Her hair had come loose from wherever it had been pinned and hung across her face in matted dark ropes, heavy with ice at the ends. She was slumped at an angle that told him she had been standing at some point and had simply stopped having the strength for it, her weight hanging against the ropes rather than held up by her own legs, which were folded under her at a terrible angle. At her feet, wrapped in what appeared to be a single wool shawl that had been torn directly down the center and divided between them, lay 2 infants, newborns, or close enough to it, small enough that each of them could have fit in one of his hands with room to spare. They were screaming with the full and absolute conviction of creatures who have only the most basic understanding of their situation and have determined that it is entirely unacceptable. They were cold. They were hungry. They had been separated from warmth, and they had decided, with the democratic ferocity of the very new, that this fact required immediate correction. Colt dismounted. He did not call out. He did not slow his approach or announce himself or do anything except move. Because moving was what was needed and everything else could wait. He reached the woman in 6 strides, pulled the knife from his belt, and cut through the rope at her left wrist. She pitched forward immediately, her body having exhausted whatever reserve had been keeping her upright, and he caught her across the back and held her weight against his chest while he cut the right wrist free. She was lighter than she should have been, significantly lighter. The kind of lightness that does not come from being small, but from having nothing left. He lowered her to the ground as carefully as he could manage, and when he shifted her to get a clear look at her face, her eyes opened. Gray. They were pale as winter sky, and they focused on him with an expression that caught him somewhere below the ribs because it was not relief. It was terror. She was looking at him the way a person looks when they have run out of better options and have made their peace with whatever comes next. When she spoke, the word was barely a sound, more breath than voice, pushed out from somewhere that had very little breath left to give. Don't. He waited. Don't take them. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said in the only voice he had, which was rough from disuse and not particularly gentle under the best of circumstances, I am not taking anything. I am helping. He did not know if she heard him. Her eyes went unfocused, and her head turned to the side, consciousness retreating like something that did not want to be present for whatever came next. He turned to the infants. He had never held a newborn in his life. He had no framework for it, no knowledge of what was required, no particular confidence in his ability to do it correctly. But he reached down and gathered them up, one in each arm, with the careful awkwardness of a man doing something for the first time and knowing it matters. And they went quiet almost immediately. Whether from warmth or exhaustion or some instinct older than either of those things, they stopped screaming and went still against his chest, their small red faces pressed into the rough canvas of his coat. He stood there for a moment in the early morning cold and looked at what was around him. The broken fence post, the rope still attached to it, cut ends hanging down in the snow, the dark stains in the white. No wagon tracks leading away, no supplies left behind, no blankets, no food, no indication that anyone had intended to come back. Someone had brought this woman here and tied her to a fence post in the middle of a Wyoming February with 2 newborn children at her feet, and had ridden away, and had expected the cold to finish the job. Colt's jaw went tight. He looked down at the woman on the ground, who was breathing in shallow, uneven pulls, her lips gone the color of old bone. He assessed the situation with the practical directness of a man who has spent 37 years dealing with problems on his own. He could not carry all 3 of them on horseback with any safety. But the cabin was less than 2 miles back, and the temperature was still dropping, and there was no better option than the one directly in front of him. He wrapped both infants inside his coat and secured them against his body with his belt, one on each side, their warmth already beginning to seep through the canvas. Then he lifted the woman and placed her across the saddle, positioning her weight with care so she would not fall. She did not wake. He took Drummond's reins in one hand and began to walk. The walk back was the longest of his life, and he had lived a life with some long walks in it. He pressed his free arm against the infants inside his coat and gave them what heat he had, which was not much, but was what existed and would have to be enough. The horse moved carefully through the crusted snow, carrying the woman without complaint, and Colt walked beside it and did not let himself think about anything except the next step and the one after that. The cabin was cold when he pushed through the door. He had let the fire burn down before leaving, as he always did when he went out for more than an hour, and the single room was barely warmer than the air outside. He brought them all in, laid the woman on his bed, which was the only bed, and covered her with every blanket he owned without stopping to count them. Then he turned his attention to the infants. He had no crib. He had nothing intended for infants of any kind. He had a wooden crate that had been used for storing bolts and hinges, and he emptied it onto the floor and lined it with a folded wool blanket and set it near the hearth. And then he worked at building the fire with a speed and focus he reserved for emergencies, feeding it until the flames took hold and the heat began to move through the room with the slow authority of something reclaiming territory it had been forced to abandon. A sound from the back room. Jasper Briggs appeared in the doorway between the 2 rooms in his long underwear and heavy wool socks, his dark eyes moving from the crate near the fire to the woman on the bed to the expression on Colt's face, in that order, with the calm, methodical attention of a child who has learned that the world does not change its nature for your feelings about it, and has therefore developed the habit of assessing situations before reacting to them. He was 8 years old. He had been living at Harding Creek Ranch for 2 years, since his father, a seasonal ranch hand named Douglas Briggs, had died of a rattlesnake bite in late August, leaving behind no family, no savings, and one small boy standing in the dust outside the bunkhouse with everything he owned in a cloth sack with a faded flower print. Colt had looked at the boy for a long time that day, long enough that a different child might have looked away. Jasper had not looked away. He had held the gaze with a steadiness that was almost unsettling in someone so small, with those dark, serious eyes that had already seen enough to know that waiting was sometimes the only intelligent response to a situation. "You can stay," Colt had said finally. "How long?" "Until something better comes along." Nothing better had come along. 2 years later, Jasper slept on a cot in the back room and ate at Colt's table and did his share of the work with the same quiet attention he brought to everything. He was not a talkative child. He did not laugh easily, but he watched, and he remembered what he saw, and he understood, better than most adults Colt had known, when to speak and when to remain silent. He understood it now. He looked at the crate near the fire, where the two infants lay breathing in the uneven way of very new things, their small fists opening and closing against the air. He looked at Colt. Then he went to the wood pile in the corner and began bringing wood to the fire without being asked. Colt recognized what the boy was doing and let him do it, and went back to the woman. Her wrists were in bad condition. The ropes had cut through the skin in several places, and the cold had done something to the tissue around the wounds that he had seen once before in a ranch hand caught in a storm, a waxy, mottled quality that meant the flesh had been pushed close to its limit. He heated water in the iron pot over the fire and cleaned the wounds as carefully as his large, rough hands allowed, which was not very carefully, but it was what he had. She did not wake while he worked. He checked the infants every hour through the night, making sure they were warm enough, but not too warm, making sure they were breathing with the regularity that indicated something other than emergency. Jasper kept watch over them from the chair without being instructed to, sitting in the firelight with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the crate, and at some point after midnight he said quietly and to no one in particular, "The smaller one is June. The other one is Clara." Colt looked at him. "How do you know their names?" Jasper considered this with the seriousness he brought to most questions. "I don't, but they need names tonight." Colt said nothing for a moment. "All right," he said finally. He worked through the night, changing the cloth he used for bandaging when it soaked through, managing twice to get a few swallows of warm broth between the woman's lips during the hours when she surfaced briefly toward something resembling consciousness. Her eyes would open, pale and confused and frightened in the firelight, and then close again before she was fully present. By the time the sky outside the window began to lighten, her color had improved. The terrible blue at her lips had faded to something closer to pale. Her breathing had steadied into the rhythm of a person resting rather than a machine failing. The infants slept. Colt sat in the other chair with his head back against the wall and closed his eyes for the first time in 20 hours. He still did not know her name. He still did not know who had done this, though the land where he had found her belonged to the boundary of the Greer property, and he understood enough about what that meant to have formed a working theory. He still did not know what came next, what the morning would require of him, what complications were attached to the 3 lives he had carried through the snow. But he knew something had shifted in the world's arrangement, the way weather sometimes shifts overnight without warning, leaving a different landscape in the morning than the one you fell asleep looking at. He kept that thought at a distance and let himself rest. On the 4th morning, he woke in his chair to find her sitting up in his bed. She had her back against the wall and her bandaged wrists resting in her lap, and she was watching him with an expression that was not the terror of the fence post and not yet something he had a word for. It was the expression of someone in the careful process of calculating whether they are safe, of someone who has been unsafe enough times that the calculation has become habit. "You're awake," he said. Her voice, when it came, was steadier than he expected, still thin, still worn at the edges, but with something underneath it that was beginning to reassert itself. "Where am I?" "My ranch, Harding Creek, about 2 miles north of where I found you." She absorbed this, looked toward the crate near the fire. Both infants were sleeping in the synchronized rhythm they had already developed, breathing together as if they had made an agreement about it before they were born. "They're alive," he said. "Healthy. They eat well." Something moved through her face too quickly for him to read. A single tear traveled down her cheek, and she wiped it away with the back of her bandaged wrist, a quick and practiced gesture, the movement of someone who has made a private arrangement with herself about tears and intends to honor it. "My name is Wren," she said. "Wren Calloway." A pause, and then the second name came out differently, with a weight attached to it that the first name did not carry. "I was married to Lewis Greer." He told her his name. They sat in silence for a moment, the way strangers sit when they are measuring out how much of themselves to offer and deciding whether the other person is worth the risk. "Why did you help me?" she asked. He thought about the answer honestly, the way she seemed to be asking it honestly. "Why wouldn't I?" She looked at him with those pale gray eyes that had stopped being frightened and become something more considered. Something that was looking at him the way you look at terrain when you are trying to find the solid ground, the places that will hold weight without giving way. "Most people would have decided it wasn't their business," she said. "I'm not most people." Outside, the February wind moved across the plateau with the indifferent persistence it had maintained all winter. Inside, the fire burned, and the infants breathed, and Jasper slept on his cot in the back room. And Colt sat in his chair across from this woman he did not know, in the cabin his father had built, and his mother had filled with the sound of off-key singing. And he understood, in some part of himself that did not yet have language for it, that something had arrived here that was not going to leave the way it had arrived. He was not ready to examine that understanding. He set it aside and turned to the practical things, because practical things were what he knew how to carry. But it was there, already there. The way of fire is already there in the wood before anyone has thought to strike a match. The first days passed in the practical language of shared space. Wren moved through the cabin with the careful attention of a guest who knows she is on borrowed ground and has decided, with a quiet determination that required no announcement, that she will leave it better than she found it. She washed what could be washed. She mended what could be mended. She organized the shelf above the dry sink with a neat efficiency that Colt noticed without commenting on. The way you notice a change in the landscape and adjust your understanding of it without making a formal declaration about the adjustment. She cooked when she was strong enough, which in those first days was not always. But when she was not strong enough, she sat at the table and did something useful with her hands regardless, shelling the dried beans from the sack in the corner or refolding the cloth strips he had been using as bandages into neater squares than he had managed. And she did these things with the focused quiet of a person who has decided that she will not be a burden, who has decided this so completely and so early that it had become a kind of armor she wore without knowing she was wearing it. Colt did his best to stay out of her way. In a one-room cabin, this is not entirely possible, but there is a way of occupying space that does not press on the people around you, a way of being present without demanding to be acknowledged, and Colt had developed this skill over 12 years of living alone. He worked outside more than usual in those first days, finding tasks at the far edges of the property that kept him gone until the light began to fail, and he told himself this was because the ranch required it, which was only partially true. Jasper moved between them naturally, the way water finds its level without being directed. On the third morning, he sat down at the table across from Wren while she was nursing June and said, without any particular preamble, "Do you know how to read?" Wren looked at him. "I do. Why?" "Colt has books," Jasper said. "He never reads them out loud." Wren looked toward the shelf above the fireplace, where 3 worn volumes stood between a coffee tin and a coil of rope. She looked at Colt, who was standing at the window with his back to the room, doing what he did at windows, which was stand and look at the land and give the impression of a man whose thoughts were entirely occupied by weather and fence lines. "Does he not like reading aloud?" Wren asked. Jasper considered this with the seriousness he brought to most questions. "He doesn't talk much about anything." That evening, after supper, Wren lifted one of the books from the shelf and asked Jasper if he wanted to hear a chapter. He said yes with the gravity of someone who had been waiting for exactly this for longer than he would admit. She read for an hour, her voice finding the rhythm of the sentences with the ease of someone who had been read to as a child and had loved it enough to carry the skill into adulthood. Jasper listened without moving. Clara and June slept in their crate near the fire, and Colt sat in the corner working on a piece of saddle leather that needed conditioning, his hands moving through the familiar task while his attention went somewhere else entirely. He told himself he was not listening. He was listening. On the 5th day, Wren came outside for the first time. She stood on the porch in the coat that had become hers by default, his largest one, which hung to her knees and swallowed her shoulders, and she turned her face up to the pale winter sun with her eyes closed. She stood that way for a long moment, very still, with an expression moving through her face that Colt, watching from near the barn, did not have a word for. It was the look of someone returning to themselves after a long absence, the look of a person who has been surviving so intently that they have forgotten, until this moment, what it felt like to simply exist. "The mountains," she said, without opening her eyes. He waited. She opened her eyes and looked at the long white line of peaks against the blue sky to the west. "In Pennsylvania, we have hills, things that apologize for being large." She was quiet for a moment. "These don't apologize." He looked at the mountains. He had looked at them 10,000 times from this yard, from this particular angle, and he had always seen them as landmarks, as weather indicators, as the western edge of the world he moved through. He looked at them now and tried to see what she was seeing. "No," he said, "they don't." She turned and looked at the cabin, at the small, dark structure in the white landscape, the single window with its dim square of light. "You built this alone?" "Rebuilt. My father built the first one." She waited, in the way she had of waiting, which was not impatient and not passive, but something in between, a kind of attentive stillness that made a person feel that what they said next would be received carefully. "Fire," he said, 12 years ago. She did not press for more. She had the quality, he was beginning to understand, of knowing when something had been offered completely and when it had not, and of respecting the difference without making a performance of it. He was not accustomed to being respected in that particular way. It unsettled him more than he expected. The snow came back on the 10th day. It arrived without announcement, the way Wyoming weather prefers to arrive, as though it had been considering the matter privately for some time and had simply decided that now was the moment. By noon, the trail south toward Coldwater had disappeared. By evening, it was clear they were not going anywhere for a while. 8 days. Colt had anticipated this as a problem. The problem of 2 adults who did not know each other being confined to a one-room cabin with 2 infants and a boy of 8 and no means of escape or relief. He had steeled himself for the friction of it, for the specific discomfort of enforced proximity with a stranger. The problem, as it turned out, was smaller than the practical ones. There were cattle to be fed, wood to be split and carried in, Two infants who required feeding every few hours with the absolute democratic indifference of newborns who do not care about weather conditions or social awkwardness or the fact that the only other adult in the cabin has not shared this much space with another person in over a decade. Wren managed the infants with a focus that he recognized, after watching it for a few days, as something deeper than competence. It was the focused attention of someone who has decided that these two small lives are the thing that matters most, and has organized everything else around that decision without fanfare or complaint. She had developed a system, a rotation of feeding times and sleeping arrangements, and she knew each baby with a specificity that impressed him. Clara had developed the habit of watching Colt with the specific attention of someone taking careful inventory. June watched Wren the same way. Between the two of them, nothing in the cabin went unobserved. Jasper had appointed himself the official holder of whichever infant was not currently being fed. He would sit in the chair near the fire with one of the girls balanced carefully in his arms and talk to her in a voice too low for Colt to hear the words. Whatever he said seemed to work. June, in particular, went calm in Jasper's arms in a way that she did not immediately go calm for Colt, which Colt noticed and found mildly humbling. He did not have extensive experience being humbled by 8-year-olds. He was adjusting. Wren taught him things, not formally, not with any intention of teaching, but by doing them where he could see. She showed him how to wrap the infants so they stayed warm without restricting their breathing, demonstrated the difference between Clara's hunger cry and her discomfort cry and the particular sound she made when she was simply new to the world and finding it bewildering. She showed him that newborns are not as fragile as they appear and not as durable as you might hope, and that the territory between those two facts is where the person caring for them lives most of the time. He showed her things too. The horses. The particular temperament of the old roan mare in the near pasture, who would tolerate a stranger if you approached from the left and let her smell your hand first. How to read the specific cloud formations that preceded the worst of the winter storms, the ones that came from the northwest with a yellow cast to the light that meant you had perhaps 2 hours to prepare. Where the fence line ran, and why the northern section needed more attention than the rest. He did not explain why he was showing her these things. She did not ask. But there was a logic to it that neither of them articulated. The logic of someone learning the shape of a place because they expect to be in it for a while. On the third evening of the storm, after Jasper had gone to his cot and Clara and June had been fed and settled into the synchronized sleep they had developed, Wren sat down across from Colt at the table with a cup of coffee and said without looking up from the cup, "Tell me about before the fire. Not the night of it. Before." He looked at her. "You told me the fire happened," she said. "You told me the ending. I'm asking about before the ending." He was quiet for a moment. Before had always been a room he did not open, not because the door was locked, but because the things inside it were painful to look at, and he had learned not to look at things that were painful when looking served no practical purpose. But she was asking directly and without manipulation, and he found to his own surprise that the door opened without much resistance. He told her about his father, a quiet man not unlike himself, who had the specific gift of knowing exactly how much effort a thing required and applying precisely that amount, never more and never less. A man who measured his words the way he measured nails, using what was needed and wasting nothing. He told her about his mother, who was the opposite of quiet, who had sung while she worked with the complete unself-consciousness of someone singing for her own pleasure. Not well, but with a conviction that made the quality beside the point. Who had planted her garden every spring with a faith in seeds pressed into frozen ground in March that bordered on the irrational. and that had always, without exception, proven correct. Wren listened with both hands around her coffee cup and her eyes on his face, and she did not offer sympathy or make sounds of understanding, which he appreciated more than he could have explained. She simply listened in the way she had of listening, which was complete and careful and without any apparent agenda. "She must have loved this place," Wren said when he stopped. "She did, even when it was brutal. She used to say that land that gives easily is land that doesn't trust you yet." Something moved through Wren's expression, and then, for the first time since he had found her at the fence post, she smiled without any reservation in it, without any part of it being managed or withheld. It changed her face in a way that caught him unprepared, the way the first warm day of spring catches you unprepared even when you have been expecting it for weeks. "My mother said something like that about bread," she said. "She said if it rose too easily, it wasn't worth eating." He found himself almost smiling back. Almost. "Your turn," he said. She looked down at her coffee. Then she began. Lancaster, Pennsylvania. A childhood that had been genuinely happy in the way that poor childhoods sometimes are, before the weight of adult circumstances settles onto them. A father who read aloud every evening, whatever books the family could borrow or trade for, who had the particular gift of making every story feel as though it were happening in the room with you. A mother who died when Wren was 14, of a fever that came and went in a week, and left the family permanently rearranged. "It wasn't her I lost," Wren said, and then stopped and looked at the fire for a moment. "Or it was her, but it was also the feeling of having someone standing between you and everything that could happen, that particular safety." She paused. "I haven't had it since." Colt looked at her. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the yard with a sound like distant water, and the fire shifted in the hearth, and Jasper's breathing from the back room was slow and even. "What made you answer the advertisement?" he asked. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, "My father broke his leg the winter before. He couldn't work the way he could before. The medical costs were significant." She turned her coffee cup slowly in her hands. There came a point where the choice between medicine and food became a real one, the kind of choice a family learns to look directly in the face. "And the man," he said it carefully, "Louis Greer. He was direct in his letters, not warm but honest. He offered reasonable terms." She looked at the fire. "I came to Wyoming in June with a trunk and a letter of introduction to marry a man whose handwriting I knew better than his face. He was older than I had imagined. The house was larger. His family was nothing like what I had prepared for. The Greers, Edmund specifically." Her voice did not change in volume or tone, but something in it went flat in the way a voice goes flat when it is being very controlled about something. "He looked at me from the first day the way you look at an expense you have decided was not worth what you paid, as though the question of my value had already been answered and the answer was unfavorable." She told him about the pregnancy, about the moment the midwife confirmed twins, about the specific quality of the silence that fell in the Greer household when the same midwife confirmed both children appeared to be girls. About Louis going to Cheyenne in January on business he did not explain and not coming back, and the letter from a stranger arriving instead with the kind of news that strangers carry when they have been paid to carry the worst of it. Louis Greer had been shot in the back during a card dispute in a saloon on the eastern edge of the city. He had died before anyone thought to send for a doctor. 3 days after Wren gave birth, Edmund's letter arrived. One sentence, essentially. She had 1 day to leave the house. I told him I had given birth 4 days prior, she said, her voice still level, still controlled, that the children were premature, that I was not physically capable of leaving in winter conditions without endangering all 3 of us. She paused. He didn't argue with me. He waited, Colt said. He waited until dark. She looked at her hands, at the pink scar tissue across her wrists that was still healing. They said the cold would take care of it. I heard one of them say that to another as they rode away, that by morning there would be no more questions. The fire made its sounds. Clara stirred in the crate and resettled. June slept with her fist pressed against her own cheek in the private, self-sufficient way she had already developed. Colt had been holding his coffee cup. He became aware at some point during her telling that his hand had tightened around it considerably. He set it down on the table with deliberate care. "They left you to die," he said. "Yes." "And the children." "Yes." He did not say anything for a long time. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a person absorbing something that requires space to be absorbed properly. "They won't come here," he said finally. Wren looked at him sharply. "How do you know?" "Because if they do, they'll regret it." There was something in his voice that was not a threat in the conventional sense. It was simpler and older than a threat. It was a statement of condition. The way a man tells you that a certain bridge will hold 2 horses or it will not, based on his knowledge of the bridge and not on any desire to argue about engineering. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked back at the fire. And something in the set of her shoulders changed. Something small and almost imperceptible, like the release of a tension so long held that neither of them had known it was there until it wasn't. "Thank you," she said, "for everything. You don't owe me anything." "I know. I want you to understand that I didn't come 2,000 miles to be someone's problem to solve." Her voice was steady and clear and had a core of something in it that he was beginning to recognize as the essential quality of her, the thing underneath all the careful management and the controlled voice and the practiced efficiency. It was not stubbornness exactly. It was closer to integrity. The specific integrity of a person who knows what they are worth and intends to behave accordingly, regardless of what the circumstances suggest. "I came here to work, to be useful, to make something." "I know that too. And now I'm standing in your coat on your porch with your supplies in the saddlebags, and I've brought you nothing but trouble." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, without having planned to say it, "You brought the girls." Something shifted in her expression. A door opened briefly behind her eyes, and then partially closed again, not all the way, not back to where it had been. "They're not a bargaining chip," she said quietly. "I know. I'm saying that whatever trouble you think you carried in here, you also carried them. And they're worth it." She looked at Clara and June sleeping in the firelight, their small faces peaceful in the way of creatures who have not yet learned to be afraid of the dark. Her throat moved. She did not say anything. The storm continued. On the 6th morning, the sky began to shift toward something that was not exactly clearing, but was at least reconsidering. The wind dropped from violent to merely insistent. The snow that had been falling sideways began to fall in the conventional direction. Jasper noticed the change before either of the adults did, as he often noticed things first. He came in from checking on the horses with snow on his shoulders and an expression of careful assessment on his face, the expression of a boy who has learned to observe weather the way Colt had taught him, Not just the surface of it, but the intention underneath. "It's thinking about stopping," he said. "Give it another day," Colt said. Jasper gave the sky outside the window a long, evaluating look. Then he turned and looked at Wren, and then at Colt, with an expression that suggested he was conducting an evaluation of entirely different weather conditions, the kind that exist between people in small spaces when they have been sharing those spaces long enough for certain things to become visible. He did not say whatever he was thinking. He went to the woodpile instead and began filling the box near the fire without being asked. That evening, after supper, Wren read from the book again. Jasper had pulled his chair closer to hers over the past several days, close enough that he could see the pages, though Colt suspected the boy had memorized enough of the story by this point that the page was more comfort than reference. Wren read with the same unhurried attention she brought to most things, letting the sentences breathe, pausing in the right places, her voice doing something to the words that made them feel inhabited. Colt sat with a piece of harness leather across his knees and worked at the buckle that had needed replacing since October. He was not listening. He was listening. It was during these evenings that he began to understand something about the specific quality of what had entered his cabin. Not the practical weight of it, the additional mouths and the changed rhythms and the rearrangement of daily life. He had understood that from the first morning. This was something else, something that had to do with the sound of a voice, reading in the evenings, and the smell of something cooking that was better than what he made himself, and the particular way Clara looked at the room from Wren's arms as though she owned it and intended to let everyone know. This was what the cabin had been missing. Not just people, but this. The specific accumulation of small presences that makes a place into something more than shelter. He did not examine that understanding too closely. He filed it away with the other things he was not yet ready to look at directly and went back to the buckle. On the morning of the 8th day, the trail south toward Coldwater was visible again in patches, the crusted snow uneven but passable to a horse that was careful about it. Colt stood at the window and looked south and thought about what needed to happen next. He thought about Edmund Greer, about the way that name settled in the chest when you turned it over. He thought about what a man like that did when something he wanted to make disappear had failed to disappear. He thought about the machinery that people with money and connections set in motion when they felt their position was threatened. Wren came to stand beside him. She looked where he was looking. "It's time," she said. Not a question. "I need to go into Coldwater." "When?" "Tomorrow. First thing." She was quiet for a moment. "Be careful." He looked at her. "I will." "I mean it, Colt. They are not above having something happen on a road when it suits them." He looked at her steadiness, at the way she was standing in the thin morning light coming through the single window, with the same quality she had brought to every difficult thing since the fence post. The quality of a person who looks directly at what is in front of them instead of at the place slightly to the left of it where things are easier to bear. "I know what they're capable of," he said. Then Jasper came in from the back room, still in his socks, carrying his boots in one hand. He looked at the two of them at the window and looked at the trail visible in the distance and looked at the expression on Colt's face. His dark eyes moved to the tree line along the northern edge of the property. He stood very still for a moment, the way he stood when he was thinking something through before he said it, and then he said it. "There were 2 men in the pine trees along the north fence yesterday morning. I saw them when I went to check on the horses before first light. They were watching the cabin." He paused. "One of them was the same man who was standing next to Edmund Greer outside the hardware store in October, the last time I went into Coldwater with you." The room was very quiet. Colt looked at the boy for a long moment. Jasper looked back with those steady dark eyes that had never, in 2 years, looked away from anything that needed to be looked at. "You're sure?" Colt said. "I'm sure." Wren had gone very still beside him. He could feel it without looking at her, the particular quality of stillness that is not calm, but the opposite of calm, held under precise control. The trail south was open. Edmund Greer's men had been watching the cabin. The trail being open and the men watching were not unconnected facts. Colt set down the coffee cup he had been holding. He crossed to the peg near the door and took down his coat. "I'll be back before dark," he said. Wren said his name once, quietly. He turned. She was standing in the middle of the room with Clara in her arms and the morning light on her face and the expression of someone who has something to say and is deciding, in real time, whether to say it. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Whatever they're planning, they've been planning it for a while. Don't let them be more ready than you are." He held her gaze. "All right," he said. He went out into the cold morning and rode south toward Coldwater, and the trail was rough, and the mountains were indifferent above him, and somewhere ahead of him, Harriet Voss was waiting with something she had been keeping until the right moment arrived. He thought this might be it. The night of the 17th day began like the others, supper done and cleared, Jasper at the table with his schoolwork, his pencil moving across the page with the focused deliberateness of a boy who understood that learning was not optional, that it was the one thing no circumstance could take back once you had it. Clara and June fed and settled in the crate near the fire, breathing in the synchronized rhythm they had developed over their short lives, as though they had agreed on a pace before they arrived and saw no reason to revise it. The fire burning at the steady low that was sufficient for the evening. Wren at the far end of the table with the mending basket, her needle moving through fabric with the same unhurried precision she brought to most physical tasks. Colt was in the corner with the account book, going through the winter tallies by lamplight, a task he did not enjoy, but performed with the regularity of someone who has learned that the things you do not enjoy require more attention than the things you do, not less. It was close to midnight when the crying changed. He had been asleep in the chair for perhaps an hour, the account book still open in his lap, when the sound reached him. He was awake and upright before he had fully surfaced from sleep, because the part of him that had been listening even in sleep had already understood that something was different. He had learned the sound of these two infants over 17 days in the particular way you learn things when your survival, or someone else's, depends on the learning. He knew Clara's hunger cry, which was immediate and indignant, and escalated quickly, if not answered. He knew June's discomfort cry, which was lower and more patient and somehow sadder. He knew the sounds they made when they were simply new to the world and finding the newness bewildering. This was none of those things. It was higher, sharper. It had an urgency underneath it that was different from the urgency of hunger or discomfort. It was the sound of a small body working very hard at something it should not have to work at. He was through the doorway before Wren called his name. She was already holding Clara when he came in, and even in the low firelight he could see it immediately, the flush across the infant's face that was wrong, the small fists clenched tight when they were usually loose and open, the legs pulling rhythmically toward the body in the involuntary way of something in pain. Wren pressed her lips to Clara's forehead and stayed there for a moment. When she pulled back, every careful thing she had built around herself since the fence post was gone. What was there instead was something that did not have management in it, something animal and immediate and entirely honest. "She's burning," Wren said. Colt looked at the window. Outside, the storm that had been threatening all day had arrived and had apparently decided to make a thorough job of it. The snow was not falling so much as moving sideways, driven by wind that had been building since sundown to something close to violent. The trail to Coldwater, which had been uncertain in the best conditions for the past week, was not a trail anymore. There was no doctor within reach. He absorbed this fact and set it aside, because facts that cannot be changed are not productive objects for sustained attention. "What do we do?" he said. She was already doing it. She moved to the water bucket, tested the temperature, moved to the fire to heat the pot, and she spoke as she worked in short, precise sentences that told him exactly what she needed and in what order. Water heated to a specific warmth, not boiling, not merely warm, but the particular temperature that is useful and not harmful. Clean cloth in pieces of a certain size. More wood on the fire to raise the room temperature carefully, not too much, not too fast. June moved to the far side of the crate and wrapped more warmly, away from the additional heat. Colt did each of these things as she named them. He did not ask why. The why was evident, and the doing was what was required. He heated the water and tested it against his wrist the way she showed him, which was a crude measure, but the only one they had. He found clean cloth. He added wood with the specific calibration she described, opening the cabin door briefly to read the temperature of the room against the outside air, which was something he knew how to do from years of managing livestock through cold weather. Jasper appeared in the doorway. He had woken on his own without being called. He stood in the doorway between the rooms for a moment and took in the situation with those dark eyes, and then he crossed to the crate and sat beside it with his hand resting on the wooden edge near June, who was awake and making small, uncertain sounds in response to the disruption around her. "I have her," Jasper said, to no one in particular, or perhaps to June specifically. It was not entirely clear, and it did not matter. He stayed there for the rest of the night. The 4 hours that followed were the longest Colt had spent in this cabin since the night of the fire. Wren worked with the complete and focused attention of someone whose entire self has been organized around a single point. She held Clara against her chest and applied the warm cloths with patient repetition, pressing them to the forehead and the neck and the small wrists, talking to the infant in a continuous low voice that was not quite language and not quite song, but something between them, something that existed in the register below words, in the place where comfort lives before it becomes articulate. Colt sat beside her on the floor. He did not know how to help in the way Wren was helping. His hands were too large, and his knowledge of infant illness was essentially non-existent. But he understood what it meant to be present in the specific way that presence is useful, steady, and quiet, and without the particular uselessness of a person who compensates for not knowing what to do by generating noise about not knowing what to do. He fetched what was needed when it was needed. He kept the fire calibrated. He replaced the water when it cooled. He kept time in his head so that Wren did not have to, telling her quietly when an hour had passed, when 2 had, when 3. Sometime around the 3rd hour, her hands began to tremble. Not from fear. From the sustained physical effort of holding and wrapping and unwrapping and holding again. From the specific exhaustion of a body that has been doing careful, precise work for hours without rest. He watched it happen from the corner of his eye without drawing attention to it. Then he reached over and took the warm cloth from her hands and pressed it to Clara's forehead himself. He kept his eyes on the infant. He pressed the cloth the way Wren had shown him, evenly distributed, not too much pressure, the full warmth of it against the skin. He could feel Wren looking at him, but he did not look back. He simply did the thing and kept doing it. After a moment, she put her hands in her lap and let him. They sat on the floor of the cabin with their backs against the wall and the fire burning steadily and the sound of the storm beginning, somewhere around the 4th hour, to ease at its edges. Not stopping, not yet, but losing some of its conviction, the way storms sometimes do when they have been making their point for long enough and have decided the point has been sufficiently made. Toward 4 in the morning, Clara's body unclenched. It happened gradually, not all at once. The rhythmic pulling of her legs slowed and then stopped. The tight, small fists opened. The quality of her crying shifted, dropping from that alarming high note back to something lower and more ordinary, the sound of discomfort rather than crisis. Wren pressed her lips to Clara's forehead and stayed there for a long moment, the way she had at the beginning of the night, and this time when she pulled back, the expression on her face was the most unguarded thing Colt had seen since the fence post. "She's coming down," Wren said. He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some portion of the night. He sat back against the wall. Wren sat back beside him, Clara still against her chest, and they simply stayed there on the floor, with their backs against the wall and the fire moving its light over them and the sound of the storm continuing to ease outside. June had gone back to sleep in the crate with Jasper's hand still resting on the wooden edge, the boy asleep sitting up in the chair with the particular grace of children who can rest in any position when they are tired enough. After a long time, Wren said, "Thank you. I didn't do anything. You stayed, and you were quiet, and you did what I asked." She shifted Clara slightly. Most men, when they don't know what to do, they leave, or they fill the room with noise so no one notices they don't know. You stayed, and you were steady, and you kept the room right. She paused. That was not nothing. He did not answer. He looked at the window, which was going from black to the first pale suggestion of gray. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "Why did you take us in? The real reason. Not the one where you say it was the right thing to do, because I know it was the right thing. But why did you do it when so many people would have decided it wasn't their concern?" He was quiet for a while, long enough that the silence had weight in it, the weight of something being considered seriously rather than managed quickly. "When my parents died," he said finally, "the people who could have helped didn't. They had reasons. They were occupied with their own circumstances. It wasn't their business." He looked at the fire. "I decided afterward that I wasn't going to be one of those people, that if something was in front of me that needed doing, I would do it and not calculate the cost first." "That's a harder way to live," she said. "It is. But you chose it anyway." "I did." The sky continued to lighten outside the window. Clara slept. June slept. Jasper slept in the chair with his hand on the crate, and Colt and Wren sat on the floor with their backs against the wall and their shoulders almost touching, and neither of them suggested moving, because this particular moment had a quality that did not invite disruption. Eventually, her head tipped slightly sideways and came to rest against his shoulder. She was asleep within minutes. He stayed exactly as he was. He looked at the window going from gray to pale gold as the sun came up behind the clouds, and he held the weight of her head on his shoulder with the same care he would have given to something he was afraid of breaking. And he thought about all the mornings he had watched from this same cabin, alone. And he thought about the specific difference of this one. He did not name the difference, but he understood it. The 3 days that followed Clara's fever were different, not dramatically, not in ways that would have been visible to an outside observer examining the surface of things. The work of the ranch continued. The meals were cooked and eaten. The infants were fed and held and settled. The wood was split and carried in. But something had shifted between them in the way that things shift when two people have passed through something together. When the ordinary distance that exists between people who do not yet fully know each other has been compressed by shared difficulty into something smaller and less defended. Wren was less careful with him. That was the truest way to describe it. She had been careful before in the way a guest is careful, precise and contained, occupying exactly the space she had been offered and reaching no further. Now there was less precision in it. She left her book open on the table when she stepped away from it. She asked him things that were not strictly practical. Whether the eastern sky that morning looked like more weather coming or like clearing. Which of the two horses he thought she should try to ride first when the ground was safe enough for riding. He answered the questions. He had not known until she began asking that he had opinions about these things. He had thought of himself as a man without particular preferences about the smaller categories of daily life. He was learning this was not entirely accurate. It was on the fourth morning after the fever that Colt rode into Coldwater. Harriet Voss had the gabled boarding house near the far end of the main street, a building that had been there long enough to have opinions about the town that had grown up around it. She was a woman in her mid-50s, with the kind of face that does not broadcast its history, but has had one, and she was waiting for him at the door as though she had been watching the trail north since first light. She brought him inside to the small sitting room off the entrance hall and sat across from him with her hands folded on the table and did not waste time. "I've been making inquiries," she said, "into the Greer family's financial situation." She told him about Lewis's debts. The card games in Cheyenne had not been occasional entertainment. They were a serious and sustained problem. Lewis had borrowed money from 3 different men over 2 years to cover his losses, and none of that money had been repaid. Edmund had been managing the situation quietly, paying enough to keep the creditors from moving against the estate publicly, trying to prevent the matter from reaching the territorial courts. Because if the creditors push it formally, Colt said, following the logic, a significant portion of the Greer land would have to be sold. Yes. And if Wren is recognized as having rights under the marriage contract, Lewis's estate gets divided. The land he transferred into her name comes off the table. The portion that might have been sold quietly to cover the debts becomes unavailable. So Edmund's problem gets considerably worse, Harriet nodded. He is not simply trying to protect the family name. He is trying to prevent a financial collapse that the family's name has been papering over for 2 years. She looked at Colt steadily. Edmund Greer is not only a cruel man, he is a frightened one. Frightened men are more dangerous than cruel ones. Cruelty has limits, Harriet said. Fear doesn't. She reached into the pocket of her apron and placed a packet of documents on the table between them, folded and tied with a piece of plain cord. She laid her hand flat on top of it for a moment before pushing it toward him. Lewis Greer sent these to me before he went to Cheyenne in January. He asked me to keep them in case anything happened to him. Her voice was even. He knew he was in trouble. I don't believe he knew how serious it had become. Inside there is a letter addressed to Wren, a deed to the land parcel he held in his own name, transferred into her name before his death, and a signed statement acknowledging the validity of the marriage contract and his obligations under it. Colt looked at the packet. Does Edmund know these exist? He knows Lewis had the deed drawn up separately from the family holdings. He does not know Lewis sent these to me. He has been operating on the assumption that he destroyed everything relevant when he cleared out Lewis's private papers. Harriet pushed the packet the final inch toward him. He was wrong. Colt picked it up. It had the particular weight of things that matter, which is not physical, but is somehow felt regardless. "There is something else," Harriet said. Her voice shifted slightly, taking on a quality that was not quite apology, but was in the neighborhood of it. "Something I owe you both an accounting of." She told him that she had been the one to process the correspondence that brought Wren to Wyoming. She had handled the matching service communications and arranged the introduction, and she had known the Greer family. She had seen how Lewis's first wife had been treated in the years before the woman died, the specific coldness of it, the systematic diminishment. "I chose to believe that circumstances change people," she said, "that what I had observed was a family under strain, and that Lewis himself was different from his brother." She looked at the table. "I was wrong, and a young woman and her children nearly died because I failed to act on what I knew." The room was quiet. "You're acting now," Colt said. "Later than I should have." She met his eyes. "Better than not at all, I hope." He stood to go. She stopped him at the door. "Edmund has hired a man from Cheyenne, an investigator. His assignment is to build the case that you are holding Wren against her will, and he has been watching your property and asking questions of anyone who knows you." She paused. "I want you to know that every person I am aware of who was asked that question gave the same answer, that you are, if anything, the least likely person in this territory to take advantage of anyone in a vulnerable position." Something that was not quite a smile moved across her face. "The phrase I heard most often was too stubborn and too honest." He put his hat back on. "I'll take that," he said. He rode home through the cold afternoon with the documents inside his coat and the specific alertness of a man who knows he is being watched and has decided to give the watching nothing useful. The mountains stood to the west, indifferent and enormous, and the trail unrolled ahead of him through the crusted snow. Wren was on the porch when he rode in. She had Clara against her chest, and she was watching the trail south with the expression of someone who had been standing there long enough for the cold to become irrelevant. She saw his face before he had said a word, and she came down the porch steps toward him. He told her everything. Standing in the yard with the horses behind him and the cold working at the edges of everything, he told her about Harriet, about the documents, about Lewis's debts, about Edmund's investigator, about the specific nature of the threat that was assembling itself to the south. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, looking at the mountains. "He's not just cruel," she said. "No, he's cornered." "Yes." She looked down at Clara, who was awake and regarding the middle distance with the focused attention she brought to most things. A cornered man is more dangerous than an angry one. She held the packet against her chest alongside Clara, and she was quiet for a long time. The wind moved across the plateau and took her hair across her face, and she could not push it back with her hands full, so she simply let it go. And he watched the last light of the afternoon move over her and thought about what it meant that she was still standing there, that she was standing at all, that whatever had been done to her at that fence post had not taken the particular quality of her that stood in yards in cold afternoon light and looked directly at what was in front of her instead of away from it. "We fight this properly," she said finally. "Documents, lawyers, testimony. We stand in front of a judge, and we say what happened, and we let the evidence speak. That's what we do. Together. Together. From inside the cabin, Jasper's voice came through the window, pitched with the careful casualness of a boy who has been listening and wants it known that he has been listening. Supper's not going to start itself. Wren made a sound that was almost a laugh. Colt looked at the window and felt something settle in him, something that had the shape and weight of a thing he recognized but had spent years refusing to name. He picked up the reins and led Drummond to the barn, and when he came inside, the cabin was warm and something was on the fire, and Jasper was setting the table with the efficient economy of a child who has been doing this long enough to see no reason to make a ceremony of it. And outside, the night was coming down over Wyoming with the particular finality of February nights, cold and complete and full of stars, and somewhere south of the ranch, a frightened man was making plans. But in the cabin, the fire was burning. The children were settling. And two people who had been strangers 3 weeks ago were learning the specific and unhurried geography of trusting someone, which does not arrive all at once, which comes in the way that most true things come, in small increments and quiet choices. A door left unlocked. A word spoken that you meant. A decision to stay when leaving would have been easier. It had been arriving here for days. It was not finished arriving yet. The night before they came, neither of them slept well. Colt knew it without asking. He could hear it in the particular quality of the silence from the other side of the cabin, the silence of a person lying still and thinking rather than the silence of a person at rest. He lay in the chair with his eyes open and watched the fire burn down and thought about the documents inside his coat on the peg by the door, about Harriet Voss and what she had said about cornered men, about the fresh horse tracks Jasper had found along the eastern fence line that morning, more than one set, pressed deep into the softening snow by animals that had been standing still for some time, waiting. At some point before dawn, Wren rose and went to the crate and lifted June without waking her, and sat in the chair near the fire with the infant against her chest, not feeding her, simply holding her, the way you hold something you are afraid of losing before you have been given specific reason to be afraid. Colt watched this from across the room without letting her know he was watching. He understood the impulse completely. When the sky outside began to change, he got up and dressed and went to the window. The trail south was visible in the early gray light, cutting through the snow-crusted ground toward Coldwater and everything that waited in that direction. The mountains to the west were clear and sharp against a sky that had gone the deep, uncompromising blue that followed hard, cold nights, the kind of blue that had no softness in it, that was simply itself without apology. Wren came to stand beside him. She had put June back in the crate, and she stood with her arms folded across her chest and looked where he was looking. "If they come with a legal warrant," she said. Not a question. Not exactly. The beginning of a thing she needed to say out loud in order to finish thinking it. "Then we deal with what's in the warrant," he said, "not what's around it. And if dealing with it means Wren." She stopped. He turned from the window and looked at her directly, in the way he looked at things he intended to be clear about. "I will not let them take you back to those people. I will not do that." She held his gaze for a long moment. In the early light, her eyes were the color of the sky just before it committed to being a particular kind of day, neither fully gray nor fully blue, something between the two that had its own quality. "Don't get yourself killed over us," she said. "I don't plan to." That is not the same as promising you won't." He looked at her for one more second. Then he went to the door and took down his coat and put it on. The documents were still in the inner pocket. He checked without removing them, just the pressure of his hand against his chest confirming they were there. "Whatever they're planning," he said with his hand on the door, "they're going to find the ground has shifted. They're not dealing with a woman alone anymore." She looked at him. Something opened behind her eyes and then did not entirely close again, which was different from the way it had been closing before. "No," she said quietly. "I suppose I'm not." He went out. He spent the morning doing what the morning required, fed the cattle, checked the fence along the south pasture where a post had been working loose for a week, split wood and stacked it against the cabin wall, because whatever happened today, tonight would still be cold, and the fire would still need feeding. He worked with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has decided that the best preparation for what is coming is to have done everything that needed doing, so that when it arrives, there is nothing left undone. Jasper worked alongside him without being asked, as he usually did on mornings when he did not have schoolwork, and he did not ask questions. He had the particular wisdom of a child who understands that some mornings are not for questions. They heard the horses before they saw them. Colt was in the barn working on the wheel spoke that had cracked in the last cold snap when the sound reached him. He set down the mallet and the chisel with a specific unhurried movement, the movement of a man who has been waiting for something and is relieved, in a particular way, that the waiting is over. He walked to the barn door and looked south. 8 riders. He counted them while they were still far enough down the trail to be shapes rather than faces. 8 horses moving in a loose group, not fast. The measured pace of people who have the law behind them and see no need to hurry. He stood and watched them come, and he thought, with the clear, cold practicality that sometimes replaces feeling in moments like this one, about the documents in his coat, and the woman in the cabin, and the boy beside him, who had appeared at the barn door without a word, and was counting the riders with the same expressionless attention. "Stay in the barn," Colt said. "No," Jasper said. Colt looked at him. "I need to see their faces," the boy said. "All of them." He said it the way he said most things, simply and without decoration, as a statement of what was true rather than an argument about what should be. Colt held his gaze for a moment and then nodded once, because the boy was right and they both knew it. He went to the cabin first. Wren was at the table with Clara in her arms when he pushed through the door. She looked up and read his face before he spoke, the way she had learned to read it over 3 weeks of close proximity. "Get the girls into the back room," he said. "Lock the door. Don't come out unless I call you." She was already rising. "How many?" 8. Edmund is with them. There are men wearing badges." She stopped. Clara made a protesting sound at the interruption. "The law." "Marshal Beckett Shaw. I've seen him from a distance before. He's a fair man. That's the best I can say about this." She had June now, too, one infant on each arm, and she was looking at him with something in her eyes that was not fear exactly, and not resignation exactly, but existed in the territory between them. The expression of someone who has been in enough bad situations to know when one is arriving and has decided to meet it standing up regardless. Colt. She said his name with a weight in it that was different from the way she had been saying it. It had arrived at something, that weight. Something that had been traveling toward this moment for weeks. Whatever happens out there, whatever they say about you, I need you to know that I know what you are. He looked at her. "You are the man who stopped," she said. "That's what you are." He crossed to her in 2 strides, and he said what he needed to say, because this was not a moment for the kind of caution that belonged to ordinary times. "I am not going to let them take you back to the people who left you in that snow. I am not going to do that. Do you understand me?" "Yes." "Good. Go." She went. He heard the lock turn on the back room door, and he turned and walked out of the cabin into the cold morning light. He stood in the center of the yard with his rifle held down at his side, not raised, not a threat, but visible, and he waited. The riders came in from the south and stopped approximately 20 feet from the porch. Edmund Greer was on the left, on a black horse, sitting the saddle with the rigid posture of a man who has decided this morning how it will go and intends to supervise the going of it. His face had the cold economy of expression that Colt had seen on it the one time their eyes had met across the main street of Coldwater, the face of a man conducting business rather than a man feeling anything about it. Beside Edmund on a gray horse sat Marshal Beckett Shaw, 52 years old approximately, with a gray beard trimmed close and the particular physical stillness of men who have spent their lives in difficult situations and have stopped wasting energy on the ones that hadn't happened yet. He wore his badge without ceremony. He carried himself with the weight of a man who understood that the authority he represented was larger than himself and took that seriously. He dismounted without hurry. One hand rested near his sidearm, not gripping it, the habitual positioning of a professional. He walked toward Colt with measured steps and stopped at the distance appropriate for conversation between men who do not yet know if they are going to have a problem. "Colt Harding," he said. "That's right." "Marshal Beckett Shaw, Territorial Law." He did not make a performance of it. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of unlawful detention and kidnapping of Wren Calloway, widow of Lewis Greer, and the unauthorized removal of said widow's minor children from the custody of her lawful family guardians." He read it without inflection, the flat cadence of official language that has been shaped by legal machinery into something precise and impersonal. But underneath the language, Colt heard what he had been listening for: the specific wrongness of a warrant built on the wrong version of events. "The charges are false," Colt said. "That's for a judge to determine. The woman came here on her own after her husband's family attempted to kill her. She is not being held. She is here because this is the safest place available to her." Colt looked directly at Edmund, who was still on his horse and still watching with that expression of controlled satisfaction. "I found her tied to a fence post on the property boundary in the middle of a February night. 2 newborn children dying at her feet, no supplies, no blankets, no indication that anyone intended to come back." He paused. "The family you are here to return her to is the family that put her there." One of the deputies shifted in his saddle, the sound of leather and metal in the cold morning air. Shaw's expression had not changed, but something had moved behind it. He turned his head slightly and looked at Edmund. Edmund's voice came out smooth and prepared, a voice that had been rehearsed until the seams didn't show. "Wren experienced severe grief and instability following my brother's death. She left the house during the night in a confused state. When Mr. Harding found her, she was in distress. But the circumstances were the result of her own actions during an episode of acute mental instability, not of anything done by our family. We have been searching for her for 3 weeks. We are deeply concerned for her welfare and the welfare of the children." It was a good speech, practiced enough that you had to listen for what was underneath it rather than what was in it. Colt had been listening. "She has scars on her wrists from the rope," he said. He kept his voice level. "Deep ones. She did not put them there herself." Self-inflicted injury is not uncommon in cases of severe postpartum. The rope was still attached to the fence post when I cut it off her. "Marshal Shaw, that post is on the boundary line between my property and the Greer land. The rope is still there. Your deputy can ride out and see it this morning." Silence. Shaw looked at Edmund. Edmund's jaw had tightened fractionally, the first small fracture in the smooth surface. Then the cabin door opened. Every head in the yard turned. Wren came down the porch steps with Clara on her left arm and June on her right. She was not running. She was not hurrying. She walked across the frozen ground with the deliberate and unhurried pace of someone who has made a decision and is implementing it, her spine straight, her chin level, her eyes finding Marshal Shaw and staying there. She was wearing the blue dress, the only one she owned that was not torn, and she had done her hair, which Colt understood in the moment he saw it was not vanity, but armor. She had prepared herself for this. She had gone into the back room and prepared herself, and then she had unlocked the door and come out. She stopped 10 feet from the marshal, and she looked at him with those pale gray eyes, and she spoke in a voice that was absolutely clear, the voice of a person who has been waiting for this exact moment and has known what she would say in it. "My name is Wren Calloway. I was married to Louis Greer under a legal contract of marriage dated June 1881. The original documentation is in the possession of Harriet Voss of Coldwater, along with a deed to property transferred into my name by Louis Greer before his death, and a signed statement in his hand acknowledging the validity of our marriage and his obligations under it." Shaw did not speak. "I am standing before you of my own free will," Wren continued. "I have not been held here against my will at any point. This man found me dying on the boundary line of the Greer property with my children at my feet. He carried us to safety. He has housed us and cared for us and protected us from the family that left us to die." She held Shaw's gaze without any movement in it. "I am asking you, as a representative of territorial law, to hear the true account of what was done to me before you execute a warrant built on the false account of the men who did it." The yard was very quiet. One of the deputies had dismounted. He was standing a few feet back and he was looking at Wren's wrists, at the scar tissue there, visible even from where he stood, pink and recent and unmistakable in the cold morning light. He was a young man, perhaps 25, with the kind of face that had not yet learned to hide what it felt. "Lord Almighty," he said under his breath, not intending to be heard. Edmund moved his horse forward. "Wren, this behavior is exactly the kind of—" "I know what this is, Edmund." She turned and looked at him, and for the first time in the weeks Colt had known her, what was in her face had no management in it at all. It was simply true, the way things are true when a person has stopped spending energy on the performance of composure and has decided to use that energy for something else. "You need us gone," she said. "You need these girls to have no claim on Louis's estate. You need the debts he left behind to stay buried and the land to stay whole." She looked back at Shaw. "I am not confused, and I am not unstable, and I am not in distress. I am a woman telling the truth about what was done to her and asking the law to hear it." Shaw looked at her for a long moment. He looked at the scars on her wrists. He looked at Edmund. Something moved through the marshal's face that was not sympathy exactly and not anger exactly, but had elements of both. the expression of a man who has been doing a difficult job for a long time and has developed a reliable sense for when something in front of him is not what it was presented as. "Mr. Greer," Shaw said, and his voice had changed. The official cadence was still there, but something underneath it had gone harder. The patience in it replaced by something that was not patience. "I'm going to need you and your men to return to town." Edmund's face went the color of old brick. "Marshal, I have a legal warrant, which I issued based on testimony I am now finding reason to question." Shaw did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Mrs. Calloway has made serious allegations, and there is physical evidence visible that supports her account. I will need to conduct an investigation before I proceed with this warrant. She is a widow under family custody. She is a grown woman making a clear and coherent statement about crimes committed against her. Shaw's voice had a finality in it now, the finality of a door being closed. "And if those allegations have merit, you will be answering to this court, not the other way around." He turned to the young deputy who had spoken without intending to. "Henderson, ride out to the Greer North fence line. Find the post on the boundary. Document what you find." Edmund Greer went very still. It was a small stillness, easily missed by someone not paying attention. But Colt was paying attention, and he saw it, and he understood what it meant. It was the stillness of a man watching the specific thing he had been trying to prevent begin to happen anyway. The stillness of someone who has been outmaneuvered and knows it and is calculating what move remains. "This is not finished," Edmund said. The smoothness was gone from his voice now. What was underneath it was raw and less controlled, the voice of the frightened man Harriet Voss had described, rather than the cold administrator he had been performing. "No," Colt said, "but neither are we." Edmund wheeled his horse. The other men followed, the two who had been watching the cabin from the tree line among them, and Colt marked their faces as they turned and rode south, marking the specific way each of them sat in the saddle, the details a man keeps against future need. Shaw remained a moment longer. He stood in the yard and looked at Colt and then at Wren with an expression that had shifted from official to something more human. The look of a man deciding, privately, where his own accounting of events had gone wrong and how it had gone there. "I'll need written statements from both of you," he said, "within the week." "You'll have them," Wren said. He looked at her wrists once more. Then he looked at Colt, and in that look was an acknowledgement that did not require words and did not receive them. The specific acknowledgement of one man to another when the truth of a situation has become clear, and both of them know it. He tipped his hat. He rode south. The sound of hooves faded and then was gone. The yard went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when something large and dangerous has passed through them without detonating. The silence of aftermath, of breath held and then released, of the world reasserting its ordinary dimensions after being briefly enlarged by crisis. Colt looked at Wren. She was still standing in the center of the yard with a child on each arm and her spine still straight, and the composure that had carried her through the entire encounter still holding, but only at the edges now, the way ice holds at the edges while the center has already begun to change. "You were supposed to stay in the back room," he said. "I know." "I told you to lock the door." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "But I have been inside for 3 weeks, and I have let other people speak for me my entire life, and I decided this morning was the last time." She shifted Clara on her arm. "Was I wrong?" He looked at her standing there, at the scars on her wrists and the children in her arms, and the absolute refusal in her face to be managed by anyone's version of her story but her own. "No," he said, "you were not wrong." She exhaled. Something in her face finally bent. Not broke, but bent, like a green branch rather than a dry one, with the particular relief of a structure that has been under load for a very long time and has just been told it does not have to hold quite so much alone anymore. "I'm very tired," she said. "I know. And my arms are going to give out if I hold both of them much longer." He stepped forward and took June with the ease that had developed over 3 weeks of practice, and they walked back to the cabin side by side, and Jasper held the door open from the inside where he had been watching through the window, as they all knew he had been, and the 4 of them went in out of the cold together. That evening, after the children were settled and Jasper had gone to his cot, Wren sat across from Colt at the table in the firelight and said what she had been thinking through since the yard. "I want to fight this properly. Documents, testimony, a judge. I want to stand in front of the law and say what happened with the evidence behind me and let the court decide. That will take time. I know. Whatever they have planned next will be worse than today. Edmund knows the ground has shifted. That makes him more dangerous, not less. I know that too." She looked at him steadily across the table. "But I am tired of surviving. I want to actually win." Colt looked at the fire for a long moment. He thought about Harriet Voss and the documents and the specific look on Henderson's face when he saw the scars. He thought about Shaw's voice when it had changed, about the way the marshal had looked at Edmund in the yard with the expression of a man revising his understanding of a situation in real time. He looked at Wren. "Then we win," he said. She nodded once, not with relief, with resolve, which was a different thing entirely, a thing that pointed forward rather than back. "Together," she said. "Together," he agreed. Outside, the night was cold and clear. Somewhere south of the ranch, a man named Edmund Greer was riding with his plans in disarray and his fears running considerably hotter than they had been that morning. But in the cabin, the fire was burning steadily, and the children were asleep, and 2 people who had started as strangers were standing, without ceremony or declaration, on the solid ground of something that had been built between them, piece by piece, over 3 weeks of shared difficulties and shared quiet and shared choice. It did not have a name yet, but it was there. Built the way most real things are built, not all at once, not with a single grand gesture, but in the daily accumulation of small moments that are themselves, taken together, the whole of it. Outside the mountains stood where they had always stood. Inside the door was unlocked. The hearing was held on a Tuesday in early March. The snow had been gone for 2 weeks by then, and spring had arrived in the grudging way of high country spring. Not warm exactly, but no longer actively hostile. The grass along the road into Coldwater was beginning to show at the edges, pale and tentative, the specific green of things that have survived something and are carefully returning. Colt drove the wagon. Wren sat beside him with June in her lap and Clara in the basket between them that had served as a portable crib since the beginning. Jasper rode the gray horse behind, straight-backed, wearing his clean shirt for only the 2nd time in 3 months, which he had permitted without complaint on the grounds that some occasions required it. Neither Colt nor Wren spoke much on the road. The silence between them had become a different thing from what it had been in the early days of the cabin, when it was the silence of 2 strangers navigating shared space with careful attention to the boundaries. This silence had ease in it. The ease of people who have passed through enough together to know that not every moment requires filling. That some of the most honest things that exist between two people exist precisely in the spaces where neither of them is speaking. The courtroom was a large room at the back of the territorial marshal's office that did most of its work as a storage room and only occasionally remembered its judicial function. On the morning of the hearing, it was full in a way that Colt had not anticipated. Every seat was taken. People stood along the walls. The full particular population of a frontier town that has been waiting for an important thing to happen and has decided collectively that it intends to witness it. Aldous Crane presented the case with the methodical precision of a man who has organized his thinking so thoroughly that speaking it aloud requires nothing more than following a path he has already built. He laid the documents before Judge Henry Aldridge, a man in his 60s with the expression of someone who has heard every version of every story human beings are capable of generating and has stopped at being surprised by any of them. The marriage contract, the deed, Lewis's signed statement, the physical evidence Marshal Shaw had gathered from the boundary fence, documented in the marshal's own hand without editorial or embellishment. The midwife testified in the measured voice of a woman who has been the most competent person in many rooms during the worst moments of other people's lives and has no interest in anyone's opinion of her. She described Wren's condition at delivery, the prematurity of the birth, her unambiguous medical judgment that moving a woman in that condition within days of delivery in winter conditions was contraindicated and potentially fatal. The shopkeeper testified about Edmund's inquiries into Colt's ranch, the specific questions asked, the manner of asking, the calculation visible underneath it. Then Aldous Crane called Wren. She walked to the front of the room and sat in the chair beside the judge's table and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the lawyer with those clear gray eyes, and she told the truth. She had told it before. In fragments, in the cabin, in Crane's careful note-taking sessions, in the written statement she had given Shaw. But she had not told it like this, in front of a full room with Edmund Greer 10 feet away, and his lawyers watching her for the first sign of inconsistency or weakness. She told it without weakness. She told it from the beginning, and she told it to the end, and she told it in the same flat, precise voice she used when she was most serious. The voice that had no drama in it, because the events themselves contained everything necessary and required nothing added. When she described the rope, she rolled back her sleeve. The scar tissue on both wrists was still visible, pink against pale skin. She held both arms up without theatrics, simply making the fact available to the room, and then she set them back in her lap. The room was very quiet. Edmund's lawyers cross-examined her for 40 minutes, and they were skilled at what they did. They suggested confusion and grief and instability. They questioned the reliability of her memory. When one of them implied that the marks on her wrists might have been self-inflicted during a period of postpartum distress, Wren looked at him with an expression of such complete and composed refusal that the lawyer actually stopped speaking for a moment. "The ropes were still attached to the post when Mr. Harding cut them off me," she said. "Marshal Shaw has that rope in evidence. You are welcome to examine the knots." The lawyer sat down. Colt testified after her. He described the boundary fence, the cut rope, the condition of the woman and the infants, the temperature, the absence of any supplies or wagon. He described these things in the voice he used for facts, which was level and without decoration, and the description was sufficient because the facts were sufficient and did not require assistance. Then Aldous Crane called Jasper Briggs. The room shifted when the boy walked to the front. He was 8 years old, and he wore his clean shirt, and he sat in the chair with the straight back of someone who understands that the way you carry yourself tells a room things before you open your mouth. Judge Aldridge looked at him for a moment. "Son, do you understand what it means to tell the truth in these proceedings?" "Yes, sir," Jasper said. "It means saying what I actually saw and heard, not what I think would be helpful or what someone told me to say." He looked at the judge steadily. "And if I don't remember something clearly, I say I don't remember it clearly instead of guessing." Aldridge looked at Crane. "Proceed." Jasper described what he had seen from the cabin window on the day the riders came. He described the conversation in the yard with the accuracy of a boy who had been paying close attention and had a reliable memory for detail. And then Crane asked him about the men in the tree line. Jasper turned and looked at the group seated on the left side of the room. He pointed without hesitation at 2 men among those accompanying Edmund. "Those 2 men," he said, "the one in the brown coat and the one with the gray hat. 3 days before the riders came with the marshal, they were in the pine trees along the north fence line. They were watching the cabin. I watched them for most of the morning before they rode away." The room moved. The 2 men went very still. Edmund's expression, which had been controlled throughout the entire proceeding, did something that Crane later described as the most expensive face he had ever seen a man make in a courtroom. The cross-examination of Jasper lasted 11 minutes and achieved nothing except to demonstrate, by repeated failure, that the boy could not be confused or led or pressured into adjusting what he said. He had seen what he had seen. He said what he had seen. He would not say anything else. Judge Aldridge called a recess. The deliberation took the rest of the morning. When they filed back into the courtroom at noon, the room had not emptied. If anything, it had grown. Aldridge looked out over the assembled town with the expression of a man who has made a decision and is prepared to deliver it and is not interested in anyone's reaction to it. In the matter of Wren Calloway's civil claim, the court found in her favor. The deed and the marriage contract were recognized as valid and binding. Her rights to the designated property were affirmed. In the matter of the criminal charges, Edmund Greer and 2 members of his household were held for trial on charges of attempted murder and criminal endangerment. The warrant previously issued for Colt Harding's arrest was permanently withdrawn and expunged from the record. The room erupted. Edmund was taken into custody without drama. He was not a man who made scenes in public. But at the door, he stopped for a moment and looked back at the room, and his eyes found Clara and June in the arms of the neighbor woman who had installed herself in the front row at dawn and declined to vacate. He looked at the 2 small girls for a long moment. No one knew what he felt when he looked at them. He went through the door. Wren had turned into Colt. Her face was against his shoulder, and she was shaking, not with crying, but with the physical release of months of sustained vigilance. The way a structure that has been under extraordinary load will move when the load is finally lifted. The shaking of something returning to its own weight. He put his arm around her. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. Jasper stood beside them with his hands at his sides. When Colt looked at him, the boy met his eyes with the expression he used when something had gone the way it should go. Not triumph and not relief. Just a quiet confirmation. The expression of someone who had expected this outcome and was satisfied to see it arrive. "I told you I saw them," Jasper said. "You did," Colt said. They drove home in the early afternoon. The road was dry for the first time since November. The mountains were doing what they always did, standing above the business of human events, with the absolute indifference of things that have been present long enough to find urgency unpersuasive. I think I had stopped seeing it, Wren said. He looked at her. During all of this, I think I had stopped being able to see anything that wasn't the next thing to be afraid of. She was looking at the mountains, at the long white line of them against the deep blue sky. I had forgotten they were beautiful. It gets easier, he said, seeing it again. Once you know you're going to be here for a while. She turned and looked at him in the afternoon light, and the fear was finally gone from her face. And what was there instead was the person she actually was. The person who had been waiting for the circumstances to make it safe, to appear fully. I'm going to be here for a while, she said. Yes, he said. You are. He proposed on a Sunday evening 3 weeks after the hearing. He had not planned a particular evening for it. He had been working toward it the way certain things are worked toward, thinking about it constantly and being unable to identify the correct moment, because every moment seemed either too small for the weight of what he wanted to say or too large for the simplicity of how he wanted to say it. Clara and June were asleep. Jasper had gone to his cot. Colt went to the shelf above the fireplace and took down the small wooden box he kept there, the one that held the few things that had survived the fire. He set it on the table in front of Wren and sat down. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. He opened the box. Inside, on a piece of folded cloth, sat a plain gold band, worn smooth by years of use, simple in the way that things are simple when they have been made with no intention other than to last. My mother's, he said. She had her coat on the hook by the door the night of the fire. The coat survived. Wren looked at the ring. She did not reach for it. He did not have a speech. He had tried to think of one for 3 weeks, and nothing he had come up with was true enough. 3 months ago, I had a ranch and a boy and a life that was functional and empty in equal measure, he said. I didn't know how loud the empty was until it stopped. He looked at her. Clara and June are mine in every way I know how to count. Jasper is mine. I want you to be mine too. Not under a contract, under a choice, made freely, between two people who know each other now, who have sat on a floor at 4 a.m. and stood in a yard in front of armed men and watched a courtroom decide the shape of their future. He looked at the ring. I'm asking you to choose this, to choose me. The fire settled in the hearth. The night birds had begun outside, the first ones of the season, tentative and new. Wren looked at the ring for a long moment. Then she looked at her hands, at the scars on her wrists that were still there and would always be there, the permanent record of what had been done and what had been survived. The first time I came to Wyoming, she said quietly, I came because I had run out of better options. I dressed it up as a choice because I wasn't ready to call it what it was. She turned her hands over on the table. This is a choice, an actual one, made by someone who knows exactly what she is choosing. She looked at him directly. Yes, Colt Harding, I will marry you, not because I need to, because I want to. He picked up the ring. He took her left hand with the careful deliberateness he had learned to apply to the things that mattered, and he placed the ring on her finger. It fit. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. Then she looked at him, and the last door, the one that had still been slightly closed even in the best weeks between them, opened completely, and what was behind it was simply her, without management or reservation or any of the careful protective distances she had learned to maintain. He leaned across the table and kissed her. From behind the door of the back room came a voice that was approximately 60% committed to its own drowsiness. "I knew it. I knew it from the second week." Wren pulled back and laughed. The full laugh, the one he had been waiting to hear since the first time he had almost made her smile at the window in the snow, the laugh that had nothing withheld from it, that filled the cabin the way his mother's singing had once filled it, taking up all the space that silence had occupied for too long. "Jasper Briggs," she said, "you are not asleep." "I am almost asleep," came the reply with considerable dignity. "Go all the way asleep." A pause. "Congratulations," Jasper said. And then, apparently, he slept. They were married on the first Saturday in May. The ceremony was held in Harriet Voss's parlor, which had been cleared of furniture and filled with borrowed chairs from half of Coldwater, which was approximately how many people had decided they were attending, whether they had been invited or not. Harriet had simply borrowed more chairs. Wren wore the blue dress. Harriet had found a piece of cream lace and added it at the collar, and the effect was something that would not have been out of place in a considerably more elegant setting than a frontier parlor in Wyoming territory. Colt stood at the front of the room and waited. When Wren came through the doorway on Harriet's arm and the room turned to look at her, he watched her face move through something. She had expected a small room. She found a large one, full of people she recognized and people she did not. All of them turned toward her with the particular warmth of a community that has witnessed something and has decided it wants to claim a share of how it ends. She stood in the doorway for a moment, recalibrating. Then she found Colt's face and walked toward it, and everything else receded to its proper place. Jasper stood beside Colt in his clean shirt. Clara and June were in the neighbor woman's arms in the front row, both awake and regarding the proceedings with the focused interest they brought to everything new. When the minister asked if anyone had objections, Jasper raised his hand. The room went very still. "I don't have an objection," Jasper said with great care and considerable dignity. "I only want to say that I knew this was going to happen from the second week, and I think everyone present should know that." The room laughed. Not politely. Actually laughed. The kind that moves through a crowd and changes the temperature of a room. And even the minister was smiling when he recovered the floor. Colt looked at Wren. She was looking at him with the smile that had nothing managed about it, the one he had first seen when she talked about her mother's bread rising too easily. "You are going to have your hands full with him," she said quietly. "We are going to have our hands full with him," he said. The minister read the words. They spoke their answers. Colt took his mother's ring and placed it on Wren's finger for the second time, and this time it was in front of witnesses and in daylight, and with the full weight of ceremony behind it. He kissed his wife. Clara objected loudly to not being the center of attention. June joined in solidarity. The minister said something traditional that was entirely inaudible over the noise. The room laughed again. They drove home in the early evening, Jasper riding ahead on the gray horse, the girls sleeping between them in the basket that had carried them since the beginning. Colt stopped the wagon in the yard and got down and helped Wren down with June in her arms. He lifted Clara from the basket, and she stirred but did not wake. Jasper took the horse to the barn with the practiced ease of someone who has been doing this for 2 years and sees no reason to make a production of it. Colt stood before the cabin door with his daughter against his chest and looked at the structure his father had built from this territory's own timber on a July afternoon 15 years ago. He thought about Elias Harding setting each log into place with the attention of a man making something intended to outlast him. He thought about his mother pressing seeds into the frozen ground every March with the faith of someone who understood that what you put into the earth comes back to you, not always in the form you expected, not always on the schedule you had in mind, but back to you, if you were patient enough and honest enough and willing enough to stay. He thought about a February morning 3 months ago, the particular dark before dawn, the sound of two voices crying in the cold, the moment he had stopped, the single choice that had come before all the others. "Let's go in," Wren said. He opened the door. She went in ahead of him. He followed and closed the door behind them. He crossed to the fireplace and knelt and began building the fire. The first time he had built this fire after bringing them home, he had been trying to save a stranger. Now he was keeping his family warm. The same hands, the same hearth, something entirely different. Wren settled the girls and murmured to them in the low, continuous voice that was specifically for them. He heard the back room door as Jasper went in. Then, from behind that door, in the voice of someone not yet fully asleep, but intending to be shortly, "Good night." "Good night, Jasper," Wren said. A pause. One beat of silence, the kind that precedes something that has been decided on and is now being delivered. "I'm glad you stopped that morning," Jasper said. The fire took hold. The first small flames found their confidence in the hearth, and the warmth began its slow work on the air of the cabin, and the light moved across the walls, in the way that firelight has always moved across the walls of places where people have chosen to be safe. Colt stood up. Wren was beside him. She had come without him hearing her, or perhaps he had simply stopped needing to track her movement to know where she was, the way a man who has lived on a piece of land long enough knows its features without looking. She took his hand. They stood together looking at the fire. Outside, the night was Wyoming dark, the dark of open country away from cities, a dark that has depth rather than merely absence. The mountains stood somewhere in that dark, where they had always stood, indifferent and enormous and entirely themselves. But in the cabin, the fire was burning. The children were sleeping. And two people who had come to each other by the hardest possible road were standing in the warmth of a place they had made together, holding the weight of everything it had taken to arrive here. She leaned up and kissed him, and he kissed her back, and the fire burned. Every morning that came after was different from every morning that had come before.